Welcome to Launchpad, the unique radio show and podcast that celebrates new book releases and the authors that created them. Now, let's take off with your host, Grace Sammon.
Hello and welcome. This is Launchpad. I am so excited about today's episode. So on behalf of Mary Helen Sheriff, the book author marketing coach, and myself, Grace Sammon, welcome to season 2, episode 10, and to these amazing authors. We're going to have a fabulous episode today. We record in front of a live audience. So if you have comments or questions, we can see them. Please pop them in under the comments below, and we'll try to get to every single one of them. This episode is special for so many reasons. These authors come to us as friends, they are colleagues, but listen to some of the things that they have done. They are New York Times recognized, international bestsellers. They are psychoanalysts, ballet dancers. They are university professors. They have done so many amazing things. I'm so thrilled to have them with me today. So let me quickly, before we ask them to chat with us, I would like to introduce Dionne Ford, author of the memoir, Go Back and Get It. So happy to have you here, Dionne. We have Shaunna Edwards and Alyson Richman, who have co-written the novel, The Thread Collectors. And last, and definitely not least, Lisa Williamson Rosenberg, who's written a novel that I'm luckily halfway through called Embers on the Wind. Welcome to each and every one of you, and welcome to everybody who is watching us across our multiple Facebook channels. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, Dionne, let's start with you. I'm captivated by your book because it got inspired by a very unusual discovery. Tell us about your book, Go Back and Get It.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. And here's my book. I hope I'm showing it correctly. There you go. Go back and get it. So yes, the title of my memoir is Go Back and Get It. It comes from the Akan word Sankofa, and that's what the book is about. It's about going back and getting the story of my ancestors after I find a picture of them on the internet. In the photo, my great-great-grandmother, Tempe Burton, sits in between the couple who enslaved her, Colonel W.R. Stewart, a wealthy Louisiana cotton broker, and his wife, Elizabeth Macaulay. Elizabeth couldn't have children, but my great-great-grandmother, Tempe, could, and she had 6 of them with the Colonel. My great-grandmother, Josephine, was their youngest child. The picture mirrored the interracial family I'd created with my husband, and it mirrored the sexual violence foundational to slavery. It was taken in the early 1890s, 25 years after slavery ended. And so as a survivor of sexual assault myself, I wondered why Tempe would pose for what amounted to a family portrait with the couple who stole her freedom so long after slavery ended. To find out, I traveled around the country uncovering the stories of the people in that photo, my relatives, and in the process, a breach began to mend in me. Through recovering their stories, I began to heal. So Go Back and Get It is my personal journey, but it's also a deeply American tale of reckoning, hope, and healing.
You gave me chills. One more book at the top of my TBR list. This is amazing. What an amazing discovery. And I'll ask you more about that in a minute. But let's go to, because we have such great stories across the board here. Shaunna Edwards is the Harvard educated. I don't know if I mentioned that in the introduction about we've got Harvard, we've got NYU, we've got Wesley, we've got great people here. So Shaunna, Harvard educated, NYU law degree, debut novel, The Thread Collectors. Tell us about it.
Absolutely. Well, this has been my legacy project written with my decades-long friend, Alyson Richman. And so many of the things that Dionne just mentioned, it gave me chills too, because while we have a novel, those themes are resonant. In The Thread Collectors, we have 2 couples. One is a Louisiana enslaved couple, Stella, who is biracial, and she's basically in sexual bondage herself. And she's got this beloved who is a Black man, brilliant musician, William. And clandestine evening, Stella is actually sewing these tactile maps out of repurposed cloth and thread to help other enslaved men run to join the Union Army on the battlefields of Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana myself. Our musician, William, he meets Jacob Kling, who is a German Jewish immigrant, inspired by one of Alyson's own ancestors on the battlefields of Louisiana. He has a fiery abolitionist wife in New York, and she's in a quilting circle herself. So you have these four people, two couples from very different backgrounds, all against the backdrop of the Civil War. But it's really the friendship between these two men, one Jewish and one Black, on the battlefields that intertwines these couples.
Okay, TBR list is growing, and that's certainly one of the things that we want on Launchpad, to have you fall in love with your next author and fall in love with your next book. Shaunna, how did you and Alyson come to write this? Or Alyson, maybe I should ask you that.
Well, as Shaunna alluded to, we've been friends for over a decade, and our friendship has always been cemented in our mutual love of books. And actually, the first time I ever met Shaunna, she disclosed that she had always dreamt of writing a novel someday. And so we met one afternoon, maybe I think in 2017, and I had always been dreaming of a Civil War novel because of my own family history. As you know, Shaunna mentioned, I do have a great uncle who was a musician in the Union Army, but his brother actually joined the Confederacy. He was a Jewish immigrant as well, went down to Mississippi and joined the Confederate Army when the Civil War broke out. So I had always hoped to sort of mine that fraternal relationship between two brothers who were immigrants themselves to a new country, but yet choose opposing sides during the Civil War. And Shaunna and I started talking. We can talk about it more at depth after Lisa's gotten a chance to introduce her novel. But Shaunna and I started just building story together one day. And I just realized that she would be a perfect partner for writing a novel in which we can explore the Civil War through two underrepresented lenses, one Black and one Jewish.
One of the things I love doing on Launchpad is to try to find the common thread between stories. So already we have some of these common threads, and I loved that your title of your book was The Thread Collector. So I said, oh, this is going to be so much easier for me. We do have wonderful people who are joining us. Lee Bukowski, thanks for being with us. Thanks for thinking this is a great panel. I'm thrilled. Renee Winchester is loving the backstory. Michelle Ann Waite, thank you. Bambi, thank you. So let's get directly to Lisa. And I have to thank Lisa Rosenberg, because she's really responsible for getting this panel together for us. When Launchpad opened up for season 2, Lisa reached out and said, Grace, I think I have a wonderful mix of people. So I'm so thrilled to thank you publicly, Lisa, for bringing us this panel. Now tell us about Embers on the Wind.
Okay, well, first of all, you're so welcome, and I'm really excited about this because I've known a little bit about Dionne's journey, and can't wait to read her memoir. And I, of course, loved The Thread Collectors, which I think I grabbed because my background is that I'm a multiracial, my Jewish mother and Black father, and our histories merge in different kinds of ways. So that was fascinating, and I enjoyed the book very much. So Embers on the Wind actually goes back and forth between 1850, the age of enslavement, and 2019, which is, and it revolves around Whitaker House, which is an Underground Railroad safe house turned 20th century Airbnb. And it's a multi-time period sort of novel in linked stories a la Olive Kitteridge, kind of homegoing, and just one of my favorite books of stories I just read, which is Brandon Taylor's Filthy Animals, which also has that interlinked stories theme, which I really love. Anyway, the Whitaker House is it's this Underground Railroad safe house turned Airbnb, as I said, and it's touched the lives of Black women over the centuries from the age of enslavement, as I said, to 2019. So in the 19th century, freedom seekers, African-American people escaping enslavement, they hid in the root cellar. Later on, modern Black women are drawn to the house, seeking answers about themselves and their connection to slavery. For example, there's Pam, who's a teenager growing up in a housing project in Boston in the 1980s, and she's invited to Whitaker House under the auspices of a leadership trip for her kind of cohort of inner city kids, and she encounters some mysterious goings on, including possibly a ghost. Dominique is a single mother she's French Canadian descent, and she follows her grand-mère's stories back to Whitaker House to see if she can find the path of an ancestor. Her lover is Michelle, who's instructed to return to the Berkshires to heal from her own childhood traumas. Michelle's sister, Kay, who has a very special connection to Whitaker House that she herself doesn't know about, is a seer who can kind of envision the past and the secrets of Whitaker House along with her own secrets. And Galen is a Black young psychologist and new mom with postpartum depression, and she and her husband seek respite from their busy lives and kind of high pressure Brooklyn mother environment, and they get away for a Memorial Day weekend at this very special Whitaker House, and it doesn't go quite the way one would hope your vacation goes. But I won't say any more about that.
No, it does not. And Victoria Kent Kay loved your novel, Lisa. So it's lovely to have you with us.
Okay.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria. She's my cousin.
Well, this is one of the reasons I love Launchpad so much. We get some interaction with people who have questions about our books and also have read our books. There are two themes that came through over and over again for me. And one was this reality of enslavement and all that meant in terms of physical abuse and sexual abuse, and how that is mirrored in some of your own personal lives, but also the idea of freedom and what it means to be free. Because Lisa, even in your book, that's something that your present day characters will not enslaved people as they were in the 1800s.
Sure.
So let's each of you talk a little bit about that idea of what it means to be free. And I'd like to go back to Dionne for that, because I'm still fascinated by how your great sat there between the two of them. So talk about what it means to be free and the search for freedom there.
Sure. I'm so glad that you bring up this topic, because I think it's underexplored when it comes to enslaved women. Often we hear them spoken about only in the context of their domination, but not so much in the ways that they strove for autonomy within their own lives under this system. And what was so exciting for me was to see the many ways that my great-great-grandmother Tempe did reach for autonomy. You know, she was a devout Methodist Episcopal, and that comes up a lot in newspaper articles about her, particularly when she died, just how devout she was. And I was able to trace that thread. You know, I grew up in the First Methodist Church and then African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so it was really exciting to see that something that I originally thought must have come from the dominating part of my ancestry actually had deep roots from the enslaved women in my family. So that's just one of the ways that comes to mind. But there were other ways. You know, Tempe ended up being a property owner. I mean, a woman in Mississippi owning property, amazing, and found a way to, you know, hand down that property to two of her girls. So exciting to me. So these were just things that I feel, you know, definitely aren't talked about that much, you know, and that were just really empowering for me as I continue to kind of look to, you know, my own autonomy within a very patriarchal society, even in 2023.
Well, let's have both Shaunna and Alyson address this same question, because I love that, Dionne, you said part of the thread of your own story. So we're definitely going with the thread collection and collectors throughout this, because when I'm listening to the four of you, I'm also just seeing that even though those of you who wrote about the past, we're really empowering women today at the same time. So Alyson and Shaunna, just jump in on that from your common experience in this book and in the story you so beautifully weave.
Well, Shaunna, I definitely think you should, when Dionne was talking about her, great relative Timpy owning land, it made me think of Janie and how when we started to dream about this book, that you had a relative of yours who was also a woman who was a landowner, right? So
Absolutely. All of the characters in our novel are inspired to one degree or another by our family historians, but our Black matriarch, Janie, she is inspired by a great aunt of mine, Janie Roach, who managed to become financially independent and a landowner. And she was definitely in my mind. I think we also wanted to resist this narrative of Blackness, even at the time of Civil War, that it was a monolith. It's one of the reasons why we set a lot of the action in New Orleans, where I'm from, because we have free Black characters in our novel. And people are like, wait, there were free Black people in the South? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We have a biracial heroine who also has a fully Black sister who's essentially living in a subordinate position within her home. Like, they're both enslaved, but it's a different level of comfort. I think when you boil it down, though, the opposite of enslavement is choice. And I think all of our characters are looking for choice. And while they might not have ultimate choice, you do have the choice to use what you have to try to help. So when Stella collects threads and she's covertly sewing these maps, she can't just run away, but she can take the information she's able to glean and help someone else make a choice. And I guess I don't want to say that freedom can be incremental, because I absolutely don't believe that. I think everyone deserves absolute freedom. But I do think that journey towards freedom is really a lot of what we're exploring in our novel.
A beautiful answer. Alyson, can you piggyback on that too? Because you're from the Jewish side of the family, there's also a lack of freedom.
There's definitely restrictions of freedom, and this sense of otherness and outsidership, enduring a different type of racism, and bigotry, being a Jewish soldier and a foreigner in a new country. I think Shaunna and I, one thing that we should probably make clear is that we came up with our characters together. It was very important for us to create one narrative voice. We did not have, me writing the Jewish characters and Shaunna writing the Black. So we built these strong female characters with so much of our heart and our soul, our mind, and also drawing from, our unique family experiences and perspectives. When we were creating Lily, the female Jewish protagonist, it was very important to echo what Shaunna was saying about resourcefulness and being courageous in a difficult time, and how one was going to contribute to the Union effort with everything they possibly could. And so, we looked towards Ernestine Rose, who was a Jewish abolitionist and suffragette. She became this sort of real-life character we threaded through the novel to mentor the character of Lily, because Lily is born a mother. Well, she's becomes a motherless child. Her mother, dies early on in her childhood. And so we were building from that, and also thinking about what stories were passed down to me about my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, who would have been, I actually have a Jewish wedding contract from Temple Emmanuel in New York City that was my great-great-grandmother was the sister to these two brothers. And so it's dated May 1863. And when I was given this by my aunt, I called Shaunna and I said, this is just incredulous to me that when my great-great-grandmother died when she got married, your relatives wouldn't have been able to get married. So we were always putting that into the context of acknowledging each other's history, the trauma from that history, and trying to show that contrast, even though both underrepresented lenses that we were creating to look at the Civil War. Certainly the Jewish characters had more freedom than the Black characters, even though they didn't have as many freedoms, let's say, as, a white, Christian person at that time. And I should use that word freedom, cautiously, because they were free, but at the same time, they were looked at with a very different lens.
Absolutely. And Lisa, you're really the one who inspired me to look at this idea of freedom and what it means to be free. And I love, in your work, you're the psychotherapist in the group, you specialize in trauma.
Mhm.
And talk a little bit about why your story got captured this way and how you play with that idea of freedom
Mhm.
that was not
Sure.
available to slave people.
So, so my, so I think my book is the only one that wasn't inspired by my direct ancestors. Although, I had my great grandfather was enslaved. So my people have their children old in my family, so you don't have to go back. My grandparents, my father's parents, were born in 1880 and 1882. But I have the woman who inspired Clementine, who is she runs away to Whitaker House. She's 16 years old and she escapes enslavement and she's pregnant. And she is based on a woman who died in Whitaker, the house that belonged to my father-in-law. That was his summer house in the Berkshire Mountains. My father-in-law and stepmother-in-law's house in the Berkshire Mountains. That was a former stop on the Underground Railroad, and escaped freedom seekers would hide in the root cellar. And so that's where this book came from, a legend that a freedom seeking woman died in the house, not the root cellar. But I always, when I would visit the house, I would think about this woman, and apparently her ghost haunted the house, even though I never actually met her. But I would walk around at night in the house, because I'm a night owl, wondering who she was, who she'd been, why she died, and what she would think of me, a Black woman in the 21st century on vacation in this place. And my husband and his family are white and Jewish. And so I'm the only Black person, the only Black adult, it was even when after my children were born, the only Black adult that maybe she's seen since she died. And what would her ghost think of me? And that was where the story came from. And the first story I wrote was the story of the birthing room, which is a sort of a mind melding situation between Clementine, this young ghost who dies in the house. I can't give a spoiler away, but she dies in the house while giving birth, and has a confrontation with a slave catcher called a patty roller in those days. So she kind of mind melds Clementine with Galen, who is this, upper class psychologist mom, in a multiracial marriage to a white man, and she also has a baby. And so there's this kind of merging of the two of them. And right before that happens, Galen's been thinking, what would this ghost think of me? Because she knows that there was this woman who died in the house, and have I arrived? I have money, I have access, I have freedom, I can go on vacation, I can afford all the fancy strollers and baby gear that I want. And so this is when we're talking about what freedoms don't we have as Black women. So as a young mother, running out to the store, she has to kind of do her hair and make sure her baby looks fantastic. Her baby is multiracial and looks white. So she knows that somebody may look askance at her with this white baby and think, maybe that baby should be taken from her. So she's not as free as, I call it the kind of mother mass, the Brooklyn Park Slope white mother mass, where it's sort of a badge of honor to have your hair a mess and spit up on your clothes and, go out. Oh, I haven't showered for 3 days. Galen can't get away with that. And Kay, who's another character, is also, also lives in Park Slope, and she's an affluent Black mom. And there's a scene where she falls in the street and smudges her coat, and the realtor who sold her $1 million brownstone walks past her with another couple and glances down at her and sees a Black street woman and says to the couple, "We rarely see things like that in this neighborhood."
I'm
And
so glad we're having.
so that's where,
I'm interrupting, but I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I'm obviously a Caucasian woman, but I have a multiracial family at the same time. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, and just some of the language that I think has changed over, and you would have to help me more than that. Enslaved people, that is now more common language than we've ever heard, right?
Mhm.
Up until a relatively short
Mhm.
time ago, I'm not sure when people moved from slaves to enslaved, or BIPOC, that
No.
concept of the Black indigenous people of color. Our language is changing so much around this,
Mhm.
and I'm so glad that it is. So I'm particularly happy to have this conversation with each of you. So I'm totally enthralled by all of the research that went into this, but I want to go back with Dionne for a minute, and I want to ask, and this is going to be the same question to each of us, because amazingly, we only have 5 more minutes left. And I'm going to invite all of you on for a second episode. That's just have to happen. But why did each of you have to write this book? And why did you have to write it now? Dionne.
Oh my gosh. This book I had to write really since my grandfather first mentioned his grandparents when I was 12. They always intrigued me. I needed to know them. And also, there was just this part of my story as an American that never got told or got hinted at and then suppressed. That was not my shame, but somehow got made my shame. And there was a very interconnectedness to that, to my own history of being of sexual assault. And so for me to claim this story was to also to retell the story as someone who is a part of this history and is also not victimized by it, but just living. And so that has been the thing that has kept me going.
Fabulous. Thank you. And we have a request from one of our viewers to please, after the episode, go in and put a link how to buy each of your books in our link. When we air on Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, the links to how to find you will be in those notes. But please circle back in a little bit, and each of our authors will go in there. Alyson, why did you have to tell your story? And then we'll go to Shaunna, and we'll wind up with Lisa. Why did you have to tell your story, and why now? You're on mute,
You're on
Lisa.
mute.
Shaunna and I came together actually during the throes of the pandemic to write The Thread Collectors. We saw this as a project that we kept on calling it our legacy project, that we wanted to leave something beautiful, historically accurate, something that definitely illuminated dark periods of history that many people were not aware of, like the Battle of Port Hudson, the burning of the Colored Orphans Asylum in New York, but also to show rays of light during such a dark time. And I think those rays of light kind of transferred over to what we were experiencing sheltering in place, to sort of pull us out of a time where we were all feeling very isolated, and to feel that we were doing something that we were weaving in stories of our family's history, our country's history, and that when we came out of the pandemic, we were going to have something that we were truly proud of.
Shaunna, what else would you like to say about that?
Well, first, I want to say that it was not only the pandemic, we also came together to write this book after the murder of George Floyd. Our first writing day was Juneteenth, even though we had started weaving this story 3 years before. And I think for Alyson and I, the bravery that we determined to show each other in terms of telling each other what we really think, saying, no, we're not going to use this word, or here's how I hear that story when you talk about Jewish people, that for us was a little bit of rebellion against what has become an increasingly divisive world. And even though our book was published last year, I think when we look at some of the erosion of the community between Black community and Jewish community, it's almost like we need to write it again and keep on talking about it, because we have all of these marginalized people together. We should be coming together as superheroes. And that's all we really want. We want people to come together. They don't have to write a book together, but at least have that real conversation about where you're coming from.
Oh, thank you. Lisa, same question. Why this book? Why now?
So I have always been, and I'm very much always probably will be, fascinated about the continuum, the race class continuum, and how class privilege impacts Black women and our history, and kind of all the stories sort of play with that. It looks at there's a Jewish character who is the Airbnb proprietress, who has sort of a moment when the very white Connecticut couple come in, where she's aware of, wow, I've been blonde from a bottle, but it's always been sort of an apologetic blonde versus like the Connecticut, sort of a difference, nuances between Black, white, upper class, affluent, and then enslaved. And so kind of how history kind of molds freedom, and sort of, again, and as Shaunna said, almost a rebellion to the conversations that have been going on, especially during the last, I guess, decade about, well, slavery's over. Let's talk about class, and the conversations we have about affirmative action and what does freedom mean. So
each of your books is so important. I encourage everybody to fall in love with their next author. I have already fallen in love with 4 more. I want to read all of the books. And, anyone who knows me, it's all about leaving your mark on the world, which is what the quilt signifies behind us. And each of you have certainly done that. I want to thank and encourage Dionne, hold up the beautiful cover of your book. Go back and get it. Fabulous book. Shaunna and Alyson, your book, The Thread Collectors, it's already out. Thank you so much for writing it and for being with me today. And again, definitely not least, Lisa Williams Rosenberg with her amazing book, Embers in the Wind. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. This has been a copyrighted episode of Authors on the Air, Global Radio Network. Take care, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This episode is copyrighted by Grace Sammon and Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. Thank you for visiting with us on Launchpad.